My name is Fidelia Phelan. I am 32 years old. The night I arrived at the Sioux Falls Hospital to see if my father would wake up from his stroke, my stepmother barred the door, not because of a doctor's order, but because she knew I had the only access code to the digital records that proved she was a thief. She stood in that ICU hallway, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic, and told me I was nothing but a nuisance who needed to clear out so she could play the grieving wife in peace. She held up a medical proxy document with a notary stamp so perfectly aligned, it screamed of premeditated fraud. She thought she had the authority to erase me from his life, to silence the daughter who built the very firewalls protecting his company from people like her. What she failed to realize was that I didn't just understand data protection as a job. I understood it as a weapon, and she had just triggered the very security protocol designed to destroy her. Before I take you back to the moment the locks clicked into place, if you genuinely connect with stories about justice and family boundaries, please hit like and subscribe to Still Drama Stories. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? The fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit hummed with a low, steady frequency. It was a sterile engineered environment, the kind I navigated daily, though I usually dealt with climate-controlled server rooms rather than hospital corridors. I spent my days building digital fortresses for financial networks, treating data as a sacred commodity that required absolute, unwavering defense. Tonight, I stood facing a physical barrier instead of a firewall. Between me and room 412 stood a private security guard. He wore a dark, sharp suit that clashed with the medical staff's scrubs, his hands resting near his belt. Next to him stood Valerie. Her synthetic rose perfume hung heavy in the air, a cloying layer attempting to mask the sharp scent of bleach. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer. A pair of heavy gold bracelets clinked as she crossed her arms. Her eyes, cool and calculating, met mine without a trace of the grief one might expect from a woman whose husband had just suffered a catastrophic stroke. "You cannot go in, Fidelia," she said. Her voice carried a smooth, rehearsed cadence. I stopped 2 feet away. I kept my breathing even. In my profession, panic was an exploitable vulnerability. "My father is in that bed, Valerie. Step aside." "The doctors require a calm environment for Donald's recovery," she replied. She uncrossed her arms, holding up a single sheet of paper attached to a clipboard. "As his designated proxy, I am restricting his visitors, family included." My gaze dropped to the clipboard. In the cybersecurity world, a system breach rarely began with a shattered firewall. It started with a forged credential. I studied the document. It was a durable medical power of attorney, an emergency proxy. I noted my tone clinical. Drafted and executed rather quickly for a man who collapsed during dinner. Valerie offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Your father has always preferred to be prepared. He wanted me to handle his affairs if the worst happened. We signed it recently." I stepped a fraction closer. My mind, trained to detect anomalies in thousands of lines of code, caught the discrepancy instantly. The notary stamp at the bottom corner sat aligned with mechanical precision, the ink dark and uniform. More revealing was the timestamp etched into the embossed seal, 9:15 a.m. from 3 weeks prior. It was not an emergency document drafted in a panic. It was a premeditated lock installed before the crisis even occurred. A 9:15 a.m. notarization. I observed, looking back up. On a Tuesday, Dad was in Pierre finalizing a supply chain contract that morning. He did not return to Sioux Falls until late Thursday. Valerie's jaw tightened. The gold bracelets chimed as she pulled the clipboard against her chest. "The paperwork is filed with the hospital administration. The guard is here to ensure my husband's wishes are respected. I suggest you go home." I did not argue. Arguing with a compromised node was a waste of processing power. I took a step back, maintaining a neutral expression. Valerie thought a piece of paper granted her control over the board, but I knew that in South Dakota the architecture of control went far deeper than a hospital proxy. The breach was active, and the threat actor was inside the perimeter. I turned on my heel and walked away, the steady strike of my leather boots echoing down the hall. I needed to reach my terminal. The drive back from the medical center offered nothing but the sweeping dark of a South Dakota night. The interstate stretched out like a flat ribbon under a moonless sky. I did not turn on the radio. Silence was a requirement for parsing data, and my mind was already sorting the variables of what had just occurred in the intensive care unit. Valerie had not acted out of grief or panic. Her posture, the precise alignment of the notary stamp, the presence of private security. Those were calculated maneuvers. People do not hire guards to enforce boundaries during a medical emergency unless they are protecting an operation. My apartment sat on the third floor of a converted industrial building in downtown Sioux Falls. It was a space defined by function rather than comfort. No decorative throw pillows or framed motivational quotes adorned the walls. Instead, sleek metal shelves held routers, backup drives, and hardware manuals. The air inside felt crisp, chilled by the dedicated cooling unit I kept running to prevent my server racks from overheating. I dropped my keys on the counter and walked straight to my workstation. A half-drank cup of black coffee from that morning sat on the corner of the desk. I ignored the bitter scent of stale roast and sank into my ergonomic chair. I woke my machine. The cold blue glow of my dual monitors instantly bathed the room in pale light, casting sharp shadows against the exposed brick wall. My reflection stared back at me from the dark borders of the screen. My face remained unblinking. I had spent the last decade hunting digital ghosts, patching vulnerabilities for financial institutions, and neutralizing threat actors before they could siphon assets. Earning $120,000 a year as an information security analyst meant I did not deal in assumptions. I dealt in audits. My fingers found their familiar placement on the mechanical keyboard. The keys produced a rapid, satisfying click with every keystroke, a rhythmic cadence that grounded me. I opened the secure portal, connecting my terminal to my father's commercial logistics firm. He had built the company from a single warehouse into a regional distribution network, and he had trusted me to design the cryptographic infrastructure that guarded its operations. It was a closed loop, fortified with biometric access and multi-factor authentication. I typed my administrative credentials, pressed enter, and waited for the familiar dashboard to load. The screen flashed red. A stark banner rendered in unforgiving block letters appeared. Access denied. I stopped typing. The rhythmic clicking ceased, leaving the room submerged in the low hum of the cooling fans. I blinked, staring at the error code displayed in the bottom right corner. Invalid credentials. Administrator privileges revoked. This was not a glitch. This was a hostile eviction. Valerie had not just locked me out of my father's hospital room. She had weaponized that forged medical proxy to breach the corporate hierarchy. She had presented the document to the firm's legacy servers, overriding the standard protocols. And she had not done it alone. Valerie barely knew how to clear her browser history. She needed a proxy of her own to navigate the corporate network. She needed Trent. Trent was Valerie's son from a prior marriage. He wore tailored suits bought with my father's money and played golf on Tuesday afternoons while claiming to manage client relations. His actual contribution to the logistics firm amounted to shaking hands and expensing lavish lunches. He possessed a superficial charm that worked well on unsuspecting vendors, but failed to mask his underlying incompetence. Trent resented my position. He despised the fact that I held the digital keys to the kingdom while he relied on his mother's influence to secure his paycheck. Now they were using a medical crisis to execute a coordinated corporate hijacking. My jaw set. They assumed that stripping my front-facing privileges would render me blind. They underestimated the architect of the system. When I constructed the network topology for the logistics firm, I implemented a series of hidden diagnostic protocols. These subroutines were designed to monitor the system for internal decay hidden deep within the code where no superficial administrator could detect them. I opened a command prompt window. The bright red error screen vanished behind a cascade of black and green text. My hands moved across the keyboard again, the mechanical clicks echoing faster this time. I initiated a backdoor query bypassing the main interface to interrogate the server logs directly. The data began to scroll. I parsed the raw text, searching for the access point. There it was. An override command issued just 2 hours ago, leveraging a legal mandate attached to a scanned image of the medical power of attorney. Trent had utilized an administrative loophole intended for catastrophic executive succession. He had elevated his own user profile to root access, systematically severing my connections to the financial servers, the payroll database, and the operational ledgers. They were not just securing their position, they were blinding the only person capable of holding them accountable. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the reality of the situation. My father lay unconscious across town, tethered to a ventilator, while his wife and stepson dismantled the safety measures I had spent years perfecting. A typical family dispute involves raised voices and slammed doors. This was a calculated extraction. As I watched the log files compile, a sharp, dissonant chime broke the silence of the apartment. It was an automated alert from a secondary script I had written years ago, a digital tripwire designed to trigger only if anomalous financial movement occurred outside standard business hours. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen illuminated, displaying a high-priority notification routed through an encrypted channel. My eyes scanned the text. Trent was currently active on the network. He was not just locking doors, he was initiating wire transfers. I tapped the notification, expanding the data packet. The numbers materialized in stark white text. 3 separate transactions were being staged from the firm's primary operational account. The destination was not a recognized vendor or a familiar holding company. The routing numbers pointed to an offshore entity, an opaque registry notoriously used to shield assets from domestic scrutiny. The breath caught in my throat. They were not waiting for the ink to dry on their forged paperwork. They were attempting to drain the operational capital while my father was incapacitated. Moving funds across international borders required multiple authorization steps, but Trent had bypassed the primary safeguards using his elevated privileges. He was trying to push the transfers through the automated clearinghouse before the weekend banking freeze. I watched the progress indicators on my monitor. The wire requests sat in a pending state, waiting for the final institutional handshake. Trent was sitting somewhere, likely in my father's office, clicking through confirmation screens with stolen authority. He thought the transaction was invisible. He thought the money would quietly vanish into the digital ether, leaving the company starved of resources and leaving him wealthy beyond measure. I set my phone face down on the desk. The cold blue glow of the monitors reflected off the polished surface. Valerie and Trent believed they had neutralized the threat by revoking my access. They believed a piece of paper and a forged signature granted them dominion over a system they did not understand. They had brought a legal bluff to a data war. My fingers rested on the keyboard. I did not need front-facing access to sever a connection. I needed to let them think they were succeeding just long enough to trap their capital in transit. The screen blinked, registering another keystroke from Trent's remote terminal. He was close to finalizing the batch. I narrowed my eyes, visualizing the precise sequence of code required to intercept the routing protocol. They wanted to test the defenses of a security analyst. It was time to show them what happens when you trigger a trap inside a vault. The summons arrived as a pristine digital calendar invite disguised as an olive branch, but engineered as a display of dominance. Valerie organized a family alignment dinner at the most exclusive steakhouse in Sioux Falls, a venue known for its charred oak aromas, dimly lit mahogany booths, and steep minimum spending requirements. She booked the private reserve room, a space my father often utilized to close his most lucrative supply chain contracts. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. In the realm of information security, you never ignore a threat actor when they willingly invite you to observe their command center. You attend, you monitor their behavior, and you map their vulnerabilities. I arrived precisely on time, stepping out of the crisp South Dakota evening air and into the warmth of the restaurant. The private dining room hummed with the orchestrated chatter of 24 guests. Valerie had cast a wide net, extending invitations to our extended relatives, local logistics partners, and key corporate stakeholders. She stood near the head of the long table, draped in a tailored emerald dress, holding a flute of sparkling water. She worked the room with practiced efficiency, greeting my father's colleagues with somber nods and murmured assurances about his medical condition. My father married Valerie 5 years ago, long after I'd established my own career and secured my financial independence. He was a self-made man who built a regional distribution network from a single warehouse, and she was a woman who recognized a lucrative host when she saw one. From the beginning, Valerie viewed my technical expertise and financial autonomy as a direct challenge to her influence. She brought her son Trent into the marriage, a man whose entrepreneurial failures were consistently shielded by my father's capital. Trent drifted through the logistics firm with a vague executive title, contributing nothing of substance while enjoying the prestige of the corporate brand. Tonight, they intended to formalize his unearned elevation. I took my assigned seat near the far end of the table, far removed from the center of power. The visual hierarchy was unmistakable. The heavy crystal wine glasses caught the ambient light clinking sharply against gold-rimmed charger plates as the servers poured vintage reds. I remained silent, eating methodically, analyzing the room the same way I would run a diagnostic on a compromised server. The corporate stakeholders shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed leather chairs. They understood the logistics business required relentless precision, a quality Trent fundamentally lacked. Yet they nodded along out of social obligation, unwilling to disrupt the performative grief of a spouse whose husband lay unconscious in an intensive care unit. Valerie allowed the tension to build through the main course, waiting until the servers cleared the empty plates and began distributing dessert menus. She stood up, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal glass. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward her. She offered a delicate, trembling sigh, casting her gaze downward for a fraction of a second before looking out at the assembled guests. She spoke about my father's legacy, utilizing corporate buzzwords she had memorized but hardly understood. She talked about continuity, about protecting the family assets during this challenging season, and about the necessity of strong leadership. Then she turned her attention to her son. Trent puffed out his chest, adjusting the cuffs of a suit purchased with stolen operational capital. Valerie reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a heavy set of brass keys on a leather ring. They were the master keys to my father's primary commercial real estate portfolio, the physical manifestation of the firm's physical infrastructure. With a grand sweeping gesture, Valerie handed the keys to Trent. She announced to the silent room that her son would be stepping in as the acting manager of all commercial properties, effective immediately to ensure my father's vision remained intact. Trent accepted the ring, a smug, poorly concealed smirk stretching across his face. He twirled the heavy brass keys around his index finger, letting the metal clink loudly in the quiet room. It was a crude display of unearned authority, designed to force the business partners into acknowledging his new rank. Then Valerie shifted her focus. Her eyes tracked down the length of the long table, locking onto me. The atmosphere in the room crystallized into a brittle, unforgiving silence. The stakeholders and relatives held their breath, waiting for the inevitable collision. Valerie picked up a small, flimsy paper envelope from the table. She walked slowly down the aisle behind the seated guests, ensuring everyone watched her approach. When she reached my chair, she placed the cheap envelope next to my gold-rimmed charger plate. It looked absurdly out of place against the elegant table setting. I looked at her, my expression deliberately blank. "Since you will be driving to the hospital so much, dear," Valerie said, pitching her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear every syllable. "We know you need the help. We wanted to make sure you were taken care of during this difficult time." I did not break eye contact. I reached out and opened the unsealed flap. Inside sat a generic $50 prepaid gas card. The insult was surgical. It was a calculated attempt to infantilize me in front of the very corporate partners who relied on my cryptographic architecture to protect their data. Valerie wanted to reduce the firm's top security analyst to a dependent child grasping for fuel money. She expected me to react with outrage, to throw the card back, to raise my voice, and prove her narrative that I was an unstable emotional daughter incapable of handling the crisis. She wanted a scene she could leverage. I did not give her one. Instead, I offered her a chilling, calm smile. I picked up the cheap plastic card, feeling its rigid edges beneath my fingertips. "Thank you, Valerie," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Your generosity is noted." I slid the gas card into the pocket of my blazer. I traced the edge of the plastic with my thumb, anchoring my composure. Let her enjoy the applause of a captive audience. Let Trent twirl his physical keys, oblivious to the fact that I had already severed the digital locks connecting those properties to the company bank accounts. They were celebrating a successful heist while standing inside a vault I had already sealed shut. They were testing the perimeter of my compliance, unaware that my silence was not submission. It was a countdown. Valerie returned to her seat, her posture radiating a false sense of victory. The dessert course arrived, and the low hum of nervous conversation resumed. I sipped my sparkling water, my mind operating several moves ahead. The social engineering attack had concluded, but the real war was bound by data, not dinner speeches. Deep inside my blazer pocket, my encrypted mobile device vibrated with a short, rhythmic pulse. It was a notification from my secure legal contact, an elite legacy attorney I had quietly retained the moment my father was hospitalized. I kept my hands resting loosely on my lap as I read the preview text flashing silently on my smartwatch screen. The message contained forensic confirmation regarding the metadata on Valerie's forged medical proxy. The digital fingerprint of her crime had just been officially verified. The fragile illusion she had constructed at the head of this table was about to face a very cold, unforgiving reality. I left the steakhouse without another word to Valerie or Trent. The $50 gas card sat in the pocket of my blazer, a cheap plastic trophy from a hollow victory. The drive back to my apartment offered nothing but the sweeping dark of a South Dakota night. The interstate stretched out like a flat ribbon under a moonless sky. I did not turn on the radio. Silence served as a requirement for parsing data, and my mind was already sorting the variables of the evening. Valerie had not acted out of grief or panic at the hospital, nor had her performance at the dinner been a simple display of ego. Her posture, the precise alignment of the notary stamp, the public transfer of the brass keys. Those were calculated maneuvers designed to establish a false narrative of legitimate succession. People do not hire private security guards to enforce boundaries during a medical emergency unless they are protecting a clandestine operation. My apartment sat on the third floor of a converted industrial building in downtown Sioux Falls. It was a space defined by function rather than comfort. No decorative throw pillows or framed motivational quotes adorned the walls. Instead, sleek metal shelves held enterprise routers, backup hard drives, and hardware manuals. The air inside felt crisp, chilled by the dedicated cooling unit I kept running to prevent my equipment from overheating. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and walked straight to my workstation. A half-drank cup of black coffee from that morning sat on the corner of the desk. I ignored the bitter scent of stale roast and sank into my ergonomic chair. I woke my machine. The cold blue glow of my dual monitors instantly bathed the room in pale light, casting sharp shadows against the exposed brick wall. My reflection stared back at me from the dark borders of the screen. My face remained unblinking. I had spent the last decade hunting digital ghosts, patching vulnerabilities for financial institutions, and neutralizing threat actors before they could siphon corporate assets. Earning $120,000 a year as an information security analyst meant I did not deal in assumptions or emotional outbursts. I dealt in forensic audits. My fingers found their familiar placement on the mechanical keyboard. The keys produced a rapid, satisfying click with every keystroke, a rhythmic cadence that grounded my focus. Trent believed his elementary maneuver of revoking my front-facing administrative credentials equated to absolute control over the logistics firm. He fundamentally misunderstood the topography of the network I had engineered. 6 months prior, I installed a passive hardware network tap on the primary physical router at the company headquarters to monitor latency packets. It was a standard maintenance procedure. That hidden tap remained entirely invisible to the operating system. It captured raw traffic, bypassing any software-level permissions Trent had clumsily manipulated from his new executive desk. I opened a secure shell protocol, the screen filled with lines of cascading raw text. I tunneled into the network, masking my local internet protocol address through a series of encrypted relays. My objective was not to reclaim my administrative account. Reclaiming my account would trigger an alert on their end. My objective was to quietly mirror their digital footprint and extract the truth. I targeted the legal repository first. Valerie had paraded the medical power of attorney in front of the hospital guard, wielding it like a royal decree. I located the scanned portable document format file sitting in the Human Resources directory. I downloaded the file to an isolated sandbox environment and ran it through a forensic metadata extractor. People often forget that a digital file contains a hidden narrative, a structural history logging every keystroke, save, and modification from its inception. The extraction code stripped away the superficial text and revealed the underlying architecture of the forgery. The creation date flared on my screen. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the raw output. The document was not generated the evening my father collapsed. It was drafted weeks earlier. I scanned the final modification log, looking for the exact moment the digital signature was affixed and saved to the local drive. A digital timestamp reading 3:14 a.m. glowed brightly in the dark room. At 3:14 a.m. on that specific Tuesday, my father was already heavily sedated in the intensive care unit, breathing through a mechanical ventilator. He was medically unresponsive. The document was a fabricated key built while he lay unconscious, proving undeniable premeditation. The conflict shifted instantly in my mind. This was no longer a domestic dispute over hospital visitation rights or a petty display of authority at a steakhouse. It was a calculated, systemic financial crime. I minimized the legal file and pivoted my attention to the accounting databases. Trent had attempted to authorize offshore wire transfers earlier using his newly elevated root access. I needed to see how deep the rot extended into the company ledgers. I tracked the destination routing numbers he had utilized during the afternoon breach. They pointed to a shell corporation registered in a jurisdiction known for corporate anonymity and lax oversight. I initiated a deep data dive tracing the internal origin of those specific routing numbers backward through the server architecture. Trent had attempted to conceal his tracks by routing his queries through a decentralized virtual private network, but his operational security proved amateurish. He left a breadcrumb trail of localized cache files and sloppy login registries. I followed the fragmented data through the corporate firewall, slipping quietly past his rudimentary safeguards. I found a hidden directory on a secondary storage drive deliberately mislabeled as archived vendor contracts. I cracked the basic folder encryption in less than 2 minutes. Inside sat a shadow ledger. The spreadsheets contained a sprawling, meticulous record of theft. My eyes scanned the columns, processing the sheer volume of the betrayal. Trent had been siphoning operational capital for 6 months. He had authorized dozens of microtransactions, disguising them as routine software licensing fees, equipment depreciation costs, and phantom consulting retainers. The money flowed out of my father's legitimate accounts and vanished into a series of interconnected shell entities. I pulled up the public records for those specific entities using a secure background check service. The registered agent for every single shell company traced back to holding firms managed directly by Trent. Trent possessed a history of catastrophic financial negligence. For years, he played the role of a visionary venture capitalist, pouring borrowed money into doomed tech startups and luxury vehicle leases to maintain a facade of success. My father had quietly settled his debts twice to avoid public embarrassment for the family brand. But 9 months ago, my father finally closed the vault, refusing to fund another failed endeavor. Trent found himself facing leveraged liabilities and aggressive creditors demanding immediate repayment. The shadow ledger provided the exact motive. Trent was drowning in personal debt, and he decided to use the logistics firm as a private bailout fund, draining the operational lifeblood of the company to save his own skin. I reached into my desk drawer and retrieved a biometric, untraceable flash drive. It possessed hardware-level encryption, ensuring the data could never be compromised or tracked back to my terminal by any subsequent audit. I inserted the drive into the port. A secure dialog box opened on my secondary monitor. I highlighted the entire shadow ledger, the forged power of attorney metadata, and the access logs detailing Trent's midnight server intrusions. I hit export. The slow, satisfying progress bar-filling green appeared on my screen. I watched it inch forward, transferring gigabytes of stolen wealth records and fraudulent signatures into my exclusive possession. The soft hum of the server rack cooling fans in the dead of night served as the only soundtrack in the silent apartment. With every block of data secured, Valerie and Trent lost another layer of their defense. They were likely sleeping at that very moment, confident in their newly acquired wealth and presumed status, oblivious to the fact that I held their digital execution warrant. The green bar reached 100%. A quiet chime confirmed the transfer was successful. I safely ejected the flash drive and enclosed it in my palm. The metal casing felt cool and heavy against my skin. I had the digital receipts required to dismantle them completely. I possessed the undeniable proof of a 6-month embezzlement scheme and a fraudulent medical proxy. But a forensic audit alone was not always enough to secure an immediate legal victory in a probate court setting. The metadata on the forged proxy revealed the exact identity of the notary who had authorized the fake signature: Aunt Diane. The digital trail painted a crystal-clear picture of the crime, but I needed human corroboration to solidify the criminal intent and bypass any plausible deniability. I needed a spoken confession on the record. I opened a new browser window and pulled up Diane's residential address and her daily work schedule. The cyber war had provided the ammunition. It was time to deploy it in the physical world. In the realm of information security, the most sophisticated digital firewall remains vulnerable to a single compromised human element. Hardware operates on logic. Software follows rigid mathematical protocols. Human beings, however, are driven by fear, debt, and coercion. When I needed to dismantle the fraudulent corporate hierarchy my stepmother had constructed, I did not waste my time attacking her directly. Valerie possessed the cunning of a seasoned predator, shielding her actions behind thick layers of plausible deniability. I needed to locate the weak node in her network. I needed the person who facilitated the forgery. That person was her younger sister, my Aunt Diane. I knew exactly where to find Diane on a Thursday morning. She operated her life on a schedule of predictable, rigid routines. Every day before reporting for her shift as a county administrative clerk, she consumed breakfast at a faded independent diner located just off Interstate 29. I parked my vehicle in the gravel lot and walked through the double glass doors. The establishment was a relic of past decades, offering a sensory experience defined by neglect. The heavy air carried the distinct, unyielding smell of burnt diner coffee and stale hash browns baking under industrial heat lamps. A few truck drivers occupied the counter seats, speaking in low murmurs over the sizzle of grease from the open grill. Diane sat alone in a corner booth, staring out the rain-streaked window while stirring a packet of artificial sweetener into a thick porcelain mug. She presented a stark contrast to my stepmother. While Valerie draped herself in expensive emerald fabrics and heavy gold jewelry funded by my father, Diane wore sensible knit cardigans and carried a worn leather tote bag. She had spent her entire adult life seeking basic respectability, maintaining her commission as a notary public as a small badge of official standing. Yet she continually operated within Valerie's shadow, bending to the sheer force of her older sister's relentless demands. That historical subservience made her the perfect instrument for a fraudulent scheme. I approached her table without making a sound. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from her. Diane jumped her spoon, clattering loudly against the rim of her coffee mug. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, her posture instantly shrinking into the corner of the booth. I did not offer a polite greeting. I reached into my pocket, retrieved my mobile device, and placed it face down on the sticky Formica table between us. The screen remained dark, but the high-fidelity recording application was already running, capturing the ambient clatter of the diner and the shallow, uneven rhythm of her breathing. "Fidelia, what are you doing here?" Diane asked. Her voice fluttered with forced innocence. Her eyes darted toward the exit, scanning for an escape route. "Valerie told me you were dealing with severe exhaustion. You should be at home resting." "I am an information security analyst," I replied, keeping my vocal tone entirely flat and clinical. "I do not deal in exhaustion. I deal in forensic data, and the data attached to your official notary seal presents a severe chronological anomaly." Diane swallowed hard. She reached out and pulled a thin paper napkin from the chrome dispenser sitting next to the salt and pepper shakers. Her fingers trembled visibly. "I do not know what you are talking about. The paperwork for your father was standard. I witnessed the signature. You certified that document at 9:15 in the morning," I stated, ignoring her fragile defense. "My father was finalizing a regional transit contract in Pierre at that exact moment. He did not return to Sioux Falls until 2 days later. He could not possibly have been in your presence to sign a medical power of attorney." Diane looked down at her hands. Her trembling fingers began tearing the edges of the paper napkin. "A digital file contains a structural history." I continued, leaning slightly forward to ensure the microphone captured my voice clearly. "The metadata embedded in the scanned copy Valerie submitted to the hospital administration proves the document was created weeks prior to his stroke. You affixed a legal seal validating a signature that is a chronological impossibility. In the state of South Dakota, participating in the fraudulent transfer of commercial and medical authority carries severe penal consequences. We are looking at a felony charge." The small, torn white pieces of the paper napkin fluttered down onto the sticky Formica, resembling dirty snow accumulating on the table. Diane's breathing grew rapid and shallow. She refused to meet my gaze. I maintained steady, unrelenting eye contact. I offered her no comfort, no familial warmth, and no plausible exit strategy. I was applying targeted pressure to a structural fracture, waiting for the material to yield. In my profession, you do not ask a compromised node for cooperation. You isolate the node and force it to broadcast the truth. "They made me do it," Diane whispered, her voice cracked, leaking genuine despair. She leaned over the table, checking over her shoulder as if Trent might suddenly materialize from the kitchen to punish her. "I never wanted to be involved. Valerie came to my house late at night. She brought Trent with her." "Why would you risk your state commission for them?" I asked, guiding the conversation toward the underlying motive. 3 years ago, I made a mistake," she confessed. Her hands worked faster now, tearing the remaining napkin into tiny shreds until nothing but dust and scraps remained. "It was a miscalculation on my personal income tax filings. It was an honest oversight, but the penalties compounded. I owed a significant sum to the Revenue Service. Valerie paid the fine to keep me out of trouble, but she kept all the correspondence. She kept the audit letters and the collection notices. She told me that if I did not help her secure your father's estate, she would forward those old records to my employer and the state licensing board. I would lose my job. I would lose my pension. "So you signed the proxy to save your own career," I stated, ensuring the admission was clearly articulated for the hidden audio file. "It was worse than that," Diane sobbed. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, cutting paths through her simple makeup. The pages were blank. Valerie brought a stack of standard legal forms with no text filled in. She told me to stamp and sign the bottom margins of 5 different blank sheets. Your father was not even in the room. Trent filled in the clauses later to create the medical proxy and the commercial real estate transfer mandates. I never saw what they printed above my seal. The confession was perfect. I now possessed irrefutable human corroboration, verifying the exact method of the forgery. Her spoken testimony mapped flawlessly to the digital timestamps I had exported from the shadow ledger the previous night. I reached out and tapped the back of my phone, silently saving the encrypted audio file and transmitting it to my secure offsite cloud server. Valerie's fragile alliance was officially fractured. Diane was no longer a hidden threat operating in the background. She was a neutralized asset bound by her own recorded admission. I stood up from the vinyl booth. Diane looked up at me with red, pleading eyes, the crumpled pieces of the napkin stuck to her damp hands. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "I am going to fix the system," I replied. I walked away, leaving her sitting alone in the diner, surrounded by shredded paper and cold coffee. Stepping out into the crisp morning air, I felt the distinct, satisfying weight of tactical momentum. The digital war had yielded its first major casualty. I had the keys to dismantle the probate petition before Valerie could even submit it to a judge. But the landscape of a corporate hijacking is inherently fluid. As I unlocked my vehicle in the gravel parking lot, my smartwatch vibrated against my wrist with an urgent, high-priority security ping. I lifted my arm and glanced at the screen. The notification originated from a physical motion sensor installed inside my father's downtown executive office suite. The commercial building was supposed to be vacant on a Thursday morning, while the executive team navigated the ongoing medical crisis. Instead, the alert indicated multiple access points breaching the interior vault room. The system logged a door bypass using a cloned radio frequency identification badge. Trent was not waiting for his offshore wire transfers to clear the banking compliance checks. Realizing his digital avenues might be monitored, he was initiating a manual extraction. The war had just escalated from server logs to physical assets. The notification vibrating against my wrist dictated an immediate pivot in protocol. I navigated my vehicle out of the gravel diner parking lot and merged onto Interstate 29, heading toward the downtown commercial district of Sioux Falls. The South Dakota sky had turned a bruising shade of charcoal, unleashing a steady, freezing rain that pelted my windshield in a rhythmic staccato. My windshield wipers worked to clear the deluge while my mind processed the telemetry of the breach. An authorized radio frequency identification badge had bypassed the primary exterior lock of my father's executive suite. Donald was currently incapacitated in an intensive care unit, meaning his physical access card remained secured in a plastic belongings bag checked by hospital staff. Trent had not bypassed the encryption. He had performed a proximity clone. During one of Valerie's performative visits to the bedside, she likely passed a concealed scanner over my father's personal effects, harvesting the encrypted frequency. They were desperate. Digital theft requires finesse and a working knowledge of decentralized routing protocols skills. Trent fundamentally lacked. When a threat actor fails to penetrate a network architecture, they revert to analog extraction. They resort to breaking physical barriers. I pulled onto Phillips Avenue and circled the perimeter of the logistics firm headquarters. The front glass facade appeared undisturbed, mirroring the gray storm clouds rolling overhead. I bypassed the main entrance and steered my vehicle into the narrow service alley, bisecting the rear of the building. The harsh, blinding glare of halogen headlights pierced the gloomy downpour. A private, unmarked courier van sat idling next to the reinforced loading doors. The engine emitted a low, throaty rumble. The rear cargo bays were flung wide open, exposing the interior cabin to the freezing rain. I parked my vehicle at a diagonal angle across the narrow alleyway, effectively blocking the sole exit route. I turned off my ignition and stepped out into the storm. The icy rain immediately soaked through the shoulders of my blazer, but the drop in temperature only sharpened my focus. Standing near the open cargo bay was Trent. He struggled to balance a heavy reinforced archival box against his hip. The lid of the container sat slightly ajar, revealing the distinctive green and gold borders of physical stock certificates, bearer bonds, and historical property deeds. These were the foundational artifacts of my father's empire documents that predated the digital transition, holding millions of dollars in untraceable value. Trent noticed my approach. His smug demeanor vanished, replaced by a sudden jagged panic. He shoved the archival box into the arms of the startled courier standing near the bumper. "Loaded in the back," Trent commanded, his voice pitching higher than usual over the sound of the rainfall. "We need to leave now." I did not raise my voice. I projected my words with the same clinical authority I used during board meetings. "I suggest you place that box on the wet pavement," I told the courier. The courier, a young man wearing a high-visibility waterproof jacket, hesitated. He looked between Trent and me, the heavy cardboard container resting precariously against his chest. "She is just an employee," Trent snapped, stepping toward me. He misjudged the uneven terrain of the alley. His expensive leather loafers sank deep into a muddy, oil-slicked puddle. The freezing water breached the seams of his designer shoes, ruining the Italian leather instantly. "Put the box in the van and get in the driver's seat. We are leaving." I kept my eyes fixed on the courier. "The man issuing your instructions is attempting an unauthorized physical extraction of contested estate assets," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly level. "The primary owner of those documents is currently hospitalized under intensive care. If you load those certificates into your vehicle and cross state lines, you transition from a delivery driver to a participant in a federal financial crime. Interstate transport of stolen property carries mandatory sentencing minimums. Your employer will not cover your legal representation." The courier swallowed hard. The rain dripped from the brim of his cap. He glanced at the green and gold certificates peeking out of the box, realizing he was holding raw financial instruments, not corporate brochures. He lowered the heavy container onto the asphalt, stepping away from the vehicle. "I am not taking the liability for this," the courier said. He retreated toward the driver's side door. "Call another service." Trent spun around his face, flushing a mottled shade of crimson. The rain plastered his styled hair flat against his forehead, stripping away the polished venture capitalist persona he tried so desperately to maintain. "You have no authority here, Fidelia. My mother holds the medical proxy. We are securing these documents for safekeeping." "You are securing untraceable liquidity because your offshore wire transfers failed," I countered. I watched his eyes widen as the realization struck him. He did not know I had traced his digital footprint until this exact moment. "You thought you could mask your routing numbers through a virtual private network. Your operational security is as flawed as your business acumen. The bank rejected your clearance protocols because I initiated a compliance hold. You are broke, Trent, and you are out of options." He clenched his fists, taking another step forward. The splashing water around his ruined shoes highlighted his loss of control. "I will call the police," he threatened, his chest heaving with exertion. "I will have you arrested for trespassing and corporate sabotage. You are trying to steal from your own father." I welcomed the threat. I stood my ground, indicating the architecture of the building behind him. "Please initiate the call." I raised my hand and pointed toward the reinforced concrete overhang positioned directly above the loading dock doors. A high-definition, weather-resistant security camera hung from the masonry. Its red light blinked in a steady, relentless rhythm, cutting through the gray storm. That optical sensor is recording raw, unedited footage to an encrypted off-site server, I informed him. It captured you using a cloned badge to breach the vault. It captured you attempting to load bearer bonds into an unmarked transit vehicle. When the authorities arrive, I will provide them with the direct decryption key. We can review the video evidence together in the precinct lobby. Trent stared at the blinking red light. The bravado drained from his posture, leaving behind the hollow reality of a cornered thief. The courier started his engine, shifted the van into gear, and navigated carefully around my parked vehicle, abandoning the operation entirely. Trent stood alone in the freezing rain, shivering in a soaked designer suit, staring at the archival box resting in the mud. He realized kinetic force would yield the same result as his digital efforts: failure. But predators do not surrender when trapped. They search for an alternate venue to exert their leverage. "You think you are so smart with your servers and your cameras," Trent sneered, his voice dripping with venom as he backed away toward the open facility door. "You are just delaying the inevitable. My mother is meeting with the magistrate tomorrow morning. We are filing the formal probate petition to assume total conservatorship over the estate. Your digital tricks mean nothing against a signed judicial decree." He disappeared into the dark building, the heavy steel door shutting with a resounding clank. I remained in the alley, the cold rain washing over me. Trent was right about one specific variable. A municipal judge possessed the authority to override corporate security protocols and grant Valerie unrestricted access to the estate. My technical countermeasures could slow them down, but they could not permanently stop a legal mandate. I needed to shift the battlefield from the realm of digital networks to the jurisdiction of legacy law. I needed to activate the final defense my father had built before his mind succumbed to the stroke. It was time to visit the Trust Kingdom. The freezing rain from the alleyway had long since dried on my blazer by the time morning broke over Sioux Falls. I did not sleep. Sleep belonged to people who were not actively defending an empire. Instead, I drove into the heart of the downtown financial sector. South Dakota might appear to outsiders as a quiet expanse of prairie and agricultural industry, but beneath that rural exterior operated the premier global hub for asset protection. Wealthy individuals from across the globe routed their fortunes through this state because our legacy laws prioritized financial privacy and structural permanence above all else. My father understood this terrain better than anyone. He knew that the greatest threat to a self-made fortune was rarely a market crash. The true danger almost always arrived wearing a wedding ring. I parked my vehicle in a private underground garage and took the dedicated elevator to the top floor of a sleek glass building. The doors opened directly into the reception area of Smith & Associates. I bypassed the receptionist with a polite nod and walked straight back to the corner suite. The environment inside offered a striking departure from my cold, sterile server rooms. The air carried the rich, distinct scent of aged, paper-worn leather bindings and fresh lemonwood polish. This was the domain of Thomas Smith, an elite legacy attorney whose reputation was built not on courtroom theatricality, but on drafting impenetrable corporate armor. Thomas sat behind a broad mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of dense physical files. He was a man who appreciated the gravity of ink on paper. He had served as my father's primary legal architect for over 20 years, designing the foundational contracts that allowed the logistics firm to expand without exposing its core assets to liability. Thomas looked up as I entered the room. He did not express surprise at my unannounced arrival. He simply placed a heavy brass paperweight over his documents and gestured toward a high-backed leather chair opposite his desk. I sat down and delivered a precise clinical summary of the previous 48 hours. I detailed Valerie's forged medical proxy, the digital audit confirming Trent's embezzlement attempts, and the physical altercation in the loading dock alleyway. I concluded the briefing by informing him that Valerie intended to approach a municipal magistrate this morning to file a formal probate petition seeking total conservatorship over my incapacitated father and his business portfolio. I expected Thomas to start drafting counter-injunctions or contacting local judges to stall the filing. I anticipated a frantic scramble to assemble a defense. Instead, Thomas leaned back in his chair. He removed his wire-rimmed glasses, producing a small microfiber cloth from his vest pocket, and began cleaning the lenses with slow, methodical circular motions. A quiet, knowing silence stretched between us. "Your stepmother is playing checkers on a board designed for three-dimensional chess," Thomas said. His voice possessed the calm, resonant timbre of a man who held the winning hand long before the game even started. "Valerie assumes that because she shares a residential address and a marriage certificate with Donald, she holds the keys to the kingdom. She fails to recognize that Donald built a kingdom where the locks do not respond to municipal judges." Thomas stood up and walked toward the far wall of his office. He pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner concealed behind a framed historical map of the Dakota Territory. The heavy oak paneling slid backward with a muted mechanical hum, revealing a reinforced steel door. This was his climate-controlled vault, the physical counterpart to my digital servers. He motioned for me to follow him inside. The air inside the vault felt remarkably dry and perfectly regulated. Rows of fireproof lockboxes lined the walls, safeguarding the generational wealth of the region. Thomas approached a specific drawer near the center of the array, unlocking it with a specialized key from his pocket. He withdrew a thick leather-bound folder and carried it back out to the main office, resting it gently on the center of his mahogany desk. He opened the cover, sliding a dense stack of cream-colored legal parchment toward me. The pages possessed a heavy tactile weight signaling their importance. I recognized the sharp, steady strokes of my father's signature at the bottom of the first page. The ink had settled into the fibers of the paper years ago. "This is the true architecture of your father's estate," Thomas explained, tapping the header of the document. "An irrevocable South Dakota trust. Donald established this entity 10 years ago, a full half-decade before he ever met Valerie. He recognized that as his logistics firm grew, his exposure to opportunistic predators grew alongside it. He wanted to ensure that his legacy could never be dismantled by a momentary lapse in personal judgment or a sudden medical tragedy." I read the opening clauses of the parchment. "In my profession, I secured data using cryptographic algorithms. My father had utilized legacy law to achieve the exact same outcome. By placing his assets into an irrevocable trust, he legally separated his personal identity from his financial holdings. On paper, Donald Phelan did not own the commercial real estate portfolio or the majority shares of the logistics firm. The trust owned them, and a probate court only possessed jurisdiction over personal property. Valerie was preparing to ask a judge to grant her control over assets my father did not technically own." I looked up from the document, processing the magnitude of the defense. "It is an encrypted vault," I murmured, trailing my fingers over the textured paper. "She is going to file a petition to claim an empty room." Thomas offered a rare, predatory smile. The corners of his eyes crinkled with quiet satisfaction. "It is far more sophisticated than an empty room, Fidelia. Donald was not just interested in protecting the capital, he wanted to punish anyone arrogant enough to try and steal it." He turned to page 14 of the document, pointing to a specific highlighted paragraph. "Read the contingency clause," he instructed. My eyes scanned the dense legal terminology. The phrasing was intricate, but the mechanism was undeniable. The clause outlined a specific security protocol triggered by hostile action. It stated that if any third party, including a current spouse, attempted to challenge the management of the estate through a probate petition or contested medical conservatorship, a mandatory administrative shift would instantly occur. The moment Valerie filed her paperwork with the county clerk, the trust would automatically execute a defensive maneuver. Any claim initiated by a non-beneficiary immediately strips the current acting trustee of all remaining operational authority and defaults total administrative control directly to the secondary protector, I read aloud. My voice sounded hollow in the quiet room as the realization set in. I looked at the named protector listed on the subsequent line. It was my name. "Your father engineered a legal poison pill," Thomas said, sliding his wire-rimmed glasses back onto his face. He knew Valerie was financially toxic, but he kept his silence to build this trap. The moment her lawyer timestamps that probate petition at the courthouse today, she does not gain control. She unknowingly activates the sequence that legally locks her out of the estate forever and hands every single key directly to you. It is a self-executing defense. The legal fortress is impenetrable. I sat back in the leather chair feeling a profound sense of awe. My father had not been the oblivious victim I feared he was. He had foreseen the exact vulnerability of his own mortality and coded a failsafe into the bedrock of the law. Valerie believed she was executing a masterful corporate hijacking. In reality, she was walking blindly into a tripwire that would sever her from her lifestyle permanently. However, the satisfaction of the unbreachable trust did not neutralize the immediate operational threat. While Valerie busied herself at the courthouse chasing shadows, Trent remained a desperate variable. The offshore wire transfers he had initiated the previous night were still pending in the global banking queue. The trust protected the core holdings, but the liquid capital sitting in the transit accounts remained exposed until the banking compliance freeze expired. If Trent found a way to bypass the hold before the weekend, he could still siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars into his untraceable shell corporations. "The ultimate shield is in place," I told Thomas, closing the heavy leather folder. "But we have a localized breach requiring immediate triage. Trent is actively attempting to bleed the operational accounts. He initiated transfers last night that are currently sitting in a compliance holding pattern. We cannot wait for the probate judge to read this trust tomorrow. We need to suffocate their cash flow right now." Thomas nodded, his demeanor shifting from historical reverence back to tactical aggression. He reached for a fresh legal pad on his desk. "Then we do not wait for the court," he said. "We bring the hammer down on the clearinghouse." I opened my laptop, connecting to my secure mobile hotspot. The legal architecture was flawless, but it required a digital counterpart to strike the final blow against Trent's theft. We needed to launch a coordinated counterattack that would trap their stolen capital in transit, leaving them starved of resources hours before they even realized they had lost the war. I sat across from Thomas Smith, watching the veteran attorney pull a pristine legal pad from his desk drawer. The strategy we were about to deploy required a seamless fusion of my digital forensics and his encyclopedic command of financial law. Trent had initiated his offshore wire transfers using the compromised credentials, pushing hundreds of thousands of dollars toward a shadowy registry. In the global banking architecture, moving that volume of capital across international borders is never instantaneous. The funds must pass through a federal clearinghouse, a digital checkpoint designed to scan for money laundering and unauthorized diversions. I had already initiated a temporary compliance hold on the logistics firm side, but that was merely a localized speed bump. Trent could eventually bypass it if he pressured the regional bank manager using his mother's fraudulent medical proxy. We needed a permanent federal barricade. Thomas began drafting the framework for a federal dynamic injunction. This specific legal instrument functioned as a specialized weapon in the asset protection arsenal. Unlike a standard freezing order, which required days of judicial review and public hearings, a dynamic injunction targeted the clearinghouse directly. By utilizing compelling evidence of immediate felony fraud, the injunction forces federal regulators to intercept the capital mid-transit. I passed my encrypted flash drive across the mahogany desk. It contained the unassailable proof we required to trigger the intervention. The drive held the raw server access logs showing Trent spoofing his location, the shadow ledger detailing his 6-month embezzlement history, and the high-fidelity audio recording of Aunt Diane confessing to the forged notary stamp. Thomas attached my forensic audit to his legal petition. He operated his desktop computer with surprising speed for a man who surrounded himself with physical parchment. We made a mutual tactical decision not to alert Valerie or Trent to our countermeasure. Issuing a warning would only give them an opportunity to cancel the transaction and attempt a different extraction method. They might resort to physically liquidating company vehicles or auctioning warehouse equipment for pennies on the dollar to secure fast cash. We wanted them to proceed under the illusion of impending wealth. We wanted them to watch the progress bar of their theft reach 99% before hitting an impenetrable concrete wall. Thomas reviewed the final draft of the injunction, ensuring every routing number and offshore destination code matched my extracted data flawlessly. He clicked the submit button on his secure legal portal. The quiet whoosh of the email sending to the Federal Clearinghouse filled the silent office. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible sound, yet it carried the destructive force of a guided missile. The payload was delivered. The capital was now locked in a bureaucratic void. The money was no longer sitting in my father's operational accounts, but it would never reach Trent's offshore shell entities. It hung suspended in financial purgatory, guarded by federal regulators who would not release a single cent until a full criminal investigation concluded. With the trap officially set, the environment inside the corner office shifted from rapid execution to patient observation. Thomas stood up, walked over to a polished wooden credenza, and poured 2 cups of hot water from a silver carafe. He handed me a delicate porcelain cup, steeping with chamomile and mint. The herbal aroma mixed with the scent of old leather and lemonwood polish permeating his workspace. I cradled the warm cup in my hands, looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the Sioux Falls skyline. The gray morning clouds hung low over the buildings, reflecting the cold, calculated environment we had just engineered. The wait lasted exactly 47 minutes. My smartphone, resting face up on the edge of the mahogany desk, vibrated with a harsh, sudden buzz. The screen illuminated, displaying a frantic text message from Trent. The text read, "The bank system is down. Do you know what is going on?" I stared at the illuminated words, visualizing his exact posture at that moment. He was likely sitting in my father's stolen executive chair, refreshing his browser, repeatedly watching the pending status of his wire transfers turn into bright red rejection notices. The realization that his offshore safety net had evaporated was sinking into his chest. Trent was a man drowning in leveraged liabilities. His predatory creditors were expecting their payments by the end of the day, and he now possessed nothing but an empty digital wallet and a ruined pair of Italian leather loafers from our encounter in the alleyway. A second text message appeared on the screen, followed rapidly by a third. "Are you running a system update? The terminal is giving me a federal compliance error. Call me back immediately." The rapid-fire delivery betrayed his escalating terror. His polished, arrogant veneer, the one he wore while twirling the brass keys at the steakhouse, had shattered entirely. The illusion of unearned authority dissolved the moment the system demanded genuine verification. I did not type a response. I did not offer an explanation, a threat, or a taunt. I simply reached out, tapped the screen to ensure the read receipt was active, and left the message deliberately on read. Let him see that I had viewed his panic and chose to offer nothing. I picked up my porcelain cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of the herbal tea. The flavor was sharp and deeply satisfying. Letting an adversary steep in their own confusion is far more effective than engaging in a shouting match. Thomas watched me from across the desk, a quiet glint of approval shining behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He understood that in both law and cybersecurity, silence is often the most devastating response. However, cornered predators do not simply accept defeat and walk away quietly. By severing their financial lifeline, I had neutralized their ability to steal liquid capital, but I had also forced them into a state of sheer desperation. Valerie had spent her entire adult life cultivating a pristine image among the local elite. She thrived on social currency, leveraging her marriage to my father to secure board seats and country club invitations. With her corporate hijacking effectively stalled and her son facing imminent ruin, she recognized that her clandestine operation was failing. She needed to change the battlefield again. If she could not beat my data with her forged paperwork, she would attempt to destroy my credibility before we ever reached a courtroom. The silence from my phone did not mean they were surrendering. It meant they were pivoting their strategy toward public assassination. Valerie knew she could not decipher the federal injunction or the encrypted trust. Her only remaining weapon was the court of public opinion. She needed to frame me as a rogue, unstable actor, hacking into her ailing husband's estate, thereby pressuring the local authorities to intervene on her behalf. She needed to turn her peers against me to validate her eventual probate filing. As I finished my tea, I recognized the quiet before the storm. The digital war was won, but the social warfare was just beginning. The digital war had stalled Valerie and Trent, blocking their offshore extraction and leaving them starved of liquid capital. Recognizing that her clandestine financial maneuvers had failed, Valerie retreated to the only battlefield she genuinely understood: the social arena. For decades, Valerie had cultivated a pristine, untouchable image among the regional elite of Sioux Falls. She understood that in the high-stakes environment of Midwestern wealth, reputation functioned as a tangible currency. If she could not outsmart my cybersecurity protocols, she would attempt to assassinate my character, leveraging the heavy weight of country club gossip to isolate me and validate her upcoming probate filing. I intercepted the digital invitation early Friday morning. A loyal administrative assistant at the logistics firm forwarded me a calendar event Valerie had distributed to the wives of our primary shareholders, local politicians, and key hospital administrators. The event was billed as a prayer luncheon for my father, hosted in the sunroom of the Minnehaha Country Club. It was a masterclass in social engineering. Valerie intended to gather the most influential voices in the city, lock them in a room with expensive catered food, and feed them a fabricated narrative regarding my sanity. She needed to preemptively explain why she was filing for total legal conservatorship over a man whose daughter was highly capable. Her strategy relied on branding me as a volatile rogue threat. I did not block the event or contact the guests to defend myself. In the realm of threat mitigation, interrupting an adversary while they are actively recording their own perjury is a severe tactical error. You let them speak. You let them commit to their lies in front of an audience. I drove to the country club just as the luncheon commenced. The sprawling manicured lawns and grand colonial architecture of the clubhouse stood in stark contrast to the sterile efficiency of my server rooms. I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the heavy mahogany doors, bypassing the hostess stand. I wore a structured navy suit, projecting the precise clinical demeanor of a working professional rather than a grieving, erratic child. The sunroom radiated a suffocating warmth, filled with the sharp, rhythmic clinking of crystal martini glasses and silver cutlery against porcelain. The space smelled of expensive floral centerpieces, roasted duck, and the collective anxiety of wealthy individuals pretending to care about a tragedy. I stepped quietly into the periphery of the room, standing near a towering potted ficus. The attendees were seated at circular tables draped in heavy white linen. At the center of the arrangement stood Valerie. She wore a pale silk blouse, holding a microphone with a practiced, sorrowful grip. Her voice trembled with theatrical precision as she addressed the silent room. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a family in crisis. She told the shareholders that the stress of my father's stroke had triggered a severe psychological fracture in my mind. She claimed I was suffering from delusions locking the family out of crucial medical decisions and utilizing my professional hacking skills to illegally freeze my father's life savings. She dabbed the corner of her eye with a monogrammed handkerchief, playing the role of the exhausted, dedicated caretaker, attempting to protect a vulnerable patriarch from a dangerous, unstable daughter. Hushed, performative whispers rippled through the country club elite. Women leaned close to one another, their eyes wide with fabricated sympathy, shaking their heads at the tragic downfall of Donald Phelan's only child. Valerie was securing her jury. She was tying herself to a public narrative that justified her imminent hostile takeover in the probate court. I decided it was time to introduce a reality check into her fiction. I stepped out from the shadow of the ficus and walked slowly toward an empty chair at the very edge of the gathering. The rhythmic strike of my heels against the polished hardwood floor drew the attention of a few guests near the back. The whispers faltered, then multiplied, shifting from sympathetic murmurs to sharp, frantic buzzing as people recognized my presence. I pulled out the chair and sat down. The table was preset with a basket of warm artisan bread and a small dish of whipped butter. I reached out, selected a crusty slice of sourdough, and broke it in half with a quiet snap. I did not look around the room to gauge the judgment of the crowd. I calmly buttered my bread, entirely immune to the intense social pressure designed to crush me. Valerie was mid-sentence, describing the alleged terror she felt when I supposedly threatened her in the hospital corridor, when she finally noticed the sudden shift in the room's attention. She followed the gaze of the audience, scanning the tables until her eyes locked onto mine. The sugary, sorrowful smile froze on her face. The microphone dipped slightly in her trembling hand. For a fraction of a second, the polished veneer slipped, revealing the raw, jagged panic of a predator caught in the open. She expected me to burst into the room, screaming, hurling accusations, and proving her theory of my mental instability. My steady, unwavering calmness shattered her script. I raised my water glass, maintaining direct, unblinking eye contact with her over the rim. I took a slow sip. The silence in the sunroom became suffocating. The local elite watched the silent exchange, their eyes darting between the weeping stepmother at the podium and the notoriously rational data analyst eating bread at the back table. In a society built on performative outrage, my refusal to engage was an act of profound defiance. I was offering them a physical contradiction to Valerie's verbal claims. A person suffering a catastrophic psychological breakdown does not sit quietly at a country club luncheon executing flawless table manners. Valerie stumbled over her next words, her voice losing its melodic cadence. She hastily wrapped up her speech, thanking the guests for their prayers, and retreating to her seat, surrounded by her closest allies. The damage to her narrative was subtle, but undeniable. She had planted the seed of my supposed insanity, but my serene presence forced the more intelligent stakeholders in the room to question the validity of her claims. More importantly, she had now publicly defamed me in front of the primary investors of my father's logistics firm. By accusing me of federal financial crimes and corporate sabotage in a room full of witnesses, she escalated the conflict from a private family grievance to actionable corporate slander. She had eagerly handed me the very ammunition I needed for the upcoming legal slaughter. I finished my slice of artisan bread, wiped my hands on the linen napkin, and stood up. I did not offer a defense to the staring guests. Explaining the intricacies of offshore shell accounts and forged notary stamps to a room full of socialites was a waste of breath. Let them whisper, let them pity me. Their opinions held zero jurisdictional weight in the trust kingdom of South Dakota. I walked out of the sunroom with the same steady, measured pace I used to enter. I had allowed Valerie to dig her own grave in the public square. She believed she had successfully manipulated the board members into supporting her probate petition. She believed she was leaving that luncheon as the undisputed victor of the social war. Her false confidence was the exact vulnerability I required for the next phase of the operation. By feeding her ego, I ensured she would not look over her shoulder. She would proceed with her plans blindly, entirely unaware that the shareholders she just lied to were about to receive an invitation of their own. I retrieved my vehicle from the valet and drove back to my secure terminal. It was time to trap the threat actors in a digital room where tears and monogrammed handkerchiefs could not save them. The illusion of victory possesses a distinct intoxicating quality. Valerie and Trent believed their social triumph at the country club had effectively neutralized my standing within the logistics firm. Operating under that false assumption of total invulnerability, they proceeded with a scheduled luxury cruise. They utilized the company's remaining promotional travel funds to secure adjacent first-class suites on a vessel charting a course through the Caribbean. They intended to sip premium cocktails while waiting for their local attorney to file the probate paperwork. They placed physical distance between themselves and the jurisdiction of South Dakota, assuming the domestic battlefield was already conquered. They failed to comprehend that digital warfare eradicates geography. Distance was not a shield, it was an operational disadvantage. On Tuesday morning, I initiated the next phase of the countermeasure from my secure terminal. I utilized my hidden administrative credentials to bypass the standard corporate scheduling software and issued a mandatory video conference summons. The calendar invitation targeted Valerie Trent and the firm's 7 minority shareholders. I titled the event Emergency Information Technology Transition Protocol. The wording was specifically engineered to exploit Valerie's arrogance. She would interpret the invitation as my formal surrender, assuming I was finally buckling under the social pressure and preparing to hand over the digital architecture of the company. The shareholders, harboring lingering doubts from the country club luncheon, accepted the invitation to witness the resolution of the leadership crisis. The digital waiting room populated precisely at 10 in the morning. I monitored the connection logs as the participants bridged into the secure video portal. The minority shareholders appeared from various oak-paneled boardrooms across the state, their expressions grim and expectant. Then the dual video feeds from the cruise ship illuminated my secondary monitor. Valerie occupied a sunlit lounge area, bathed in tropical morning light, wearing a silk resort dress and a triumphant sugary smile. Trent broadcasted from a different location on the vessel. His webcam feed presented a sterile white background, likely a private business center deep within the ship's interior. He wore a crisp dress shirt, attempting to project the aura of a seasoned executive preparing to accept the surrender of a defeated rival. I initiated the recording function, ensuring the system generated an immutable legal transcript of the proceedings. I did not offer pleasantries or engage in casual introductory chatter. I looked directly into the camera lens, projecting the clinical, detached authority of an analyst conducting a forensic review. I addressed the shareholders first, acknowledging their presence and thanking them for attending an urgent compliance verification meeting. Then I shifted my focus to the faces broadcasting from international waters. I informed Valerie and Trent that before I could initiate the transfer of the root administrative passwords, corporate compliance mandated a verbal confirmation of their legal authority on the recorded ledger. I laid the bait with surgical precision. I asked Valerie to state for the benefit of the shareholders and the official company, record the exact timeline surrounding the execution of her medical power of attorney. I phrased the inquiry as a tedious bureaucratic formality, a minor administrative hurdle we needed to clear before finalizing her dominion over the network. The lure proved irresistible. Valerie, eager to cement her narrative in front of the firm's primary investors, smiled magnanimously into her camera. She recounted the fabricated timeline with theatrical sorrow, stating clearly and unequivocally that my father had signed the document late in the evening on the day of his stroke, right before losing consciousness. Trent nodded solemnly in his separate video window, verbally corroborating her statement and asserting his delegated authority. They had just committed perjury on a recorded corporate line. The trap was sprung. I moved my hand to the mouse and executed a pre-written script overriding the conference software. I muted every participant on the call and locked the interface, preventing anyone from disconnecting their feed or intervening. The sudden silence on the line was palpable. Valerie's sugary smile faltered, her brow furrowing in confusion as she tapped her tablet screen, trying to unmute her microphone. Trent leaned closer to his camera, the confident executive facade cracking, as he realized he had lost control of his own digital environment. I initiated a global screen share, replacing their view of my face with a stark, high-resolution display of my forensic workspace. I did not raise my voice or gloat. I delivered the data with the dispassionate tone of a prosecutor reading a verdict. I opened the initial exhibit, bringing the portable document format file of the medical proxy onto the screen. I ran the metadata extraction tool live in front of the shareholders. The hidden creation date flashed in bright green text. 3:14 a.m., 3 weeks prior to the medical emergency. I explained the chronological impossibility of Valerie's sworn statement, highlighting the undeniable proof of premeditated forgery. I switched the display to the raw server access logs. The data cascaded across the shared screen, detailing Trent's unauthorized midnight intrusion into the shadow ledger. I highlighted the specific routing numbers and the timestamped sequence of his rejected offshore wire transfers. The evidence illuminated his desperate failed attempt to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars from the operational accounts to cover his personal liabilities. On my secondary monitor, I observed Trent's reaction. The sterile white background of his webcam feed offered no distraction from his physical collapse. A distinct heavy bead of sweat formed on his temple, trailing slowly down his jawline. His mouth opened and closed in a silent, frantic panic. He was watching his entire fraudulent enterprise unravel in high definition. The visual evidence dismantled their timeline and exposed their theft, but I required a final devastating blow to eradicate any lingering doubt among the shareholders. Data can sometimes be dismissed by the technically illiterate as a computer error, but a human confession is undeniable. I closed the server logs and opened an encrypted audio file. I informed the silent audience that they were about to hear the direct testimony of the notary public whose seal appeared on the fraudulent proxy. I pressed play. The sound of the roadside diner flooded the corporate speakers. The clatter of silverware and the sizzle of a grill provided a gritty backdrop to Aunt Diane's terrified, weeping voice. The shareholders listened in total breathless silence as Diane admitted to being blackmailed. Her voice trembled through the speakers, confessing that she had stamped and signed blank sheets of paper, while my father was heavily sedated, allowing Trent to fill in the legal clauses later. The stark contrast between Diane's desperate reality and Valerie's luxurious tropical backdrop served as a brutal indictment of their greed. The audio recording removed every shred of plausible deniability. It was a flawless, irrefutable checkmate. I watched the minority shareholders on my grid view. These were stoic, pragmatic Midwestern business leaders who valued stability and truth. Their faces transitioned from initial confusion to profound, rigid anger. The pity they had directed toward Valerie at the country club luncheon evaporated, replaced by the cold realization that they had been manipulated by a coordinated criminal element. They were looking at a woman who had forged legal documents to hijack their investments and a man who had attempted to steal their operational capital. Valerie's video feed depicted a woman in freefall. She was gesturing wildly, shouting silent excuses into a muted microphone, her flawless social exterior disintegrating into raw, unfiltered terror. She recognized that her reputation, her primary weapon, was permanently destroyed. Trent had pushed himself away from his desk, pacing back and forth against his sterile white wall like a caged animal. They were stranded on a luxury vessel miles from the mainland, entirely powerless to stop the hemorrhage of their own credibility. They expected me to demand an apology to seek validation, or to negotiate terms for their surrender. They assumed the confrontation would end with a dramatic ultimatum. But true power does not require a monologue. I had presented the forensic data. I had exposed the forgery. The shareholders possessed the truth. There was nothing left to discuss. Before Valerie could type a message in the chat box, or Trent could attempt to sever his connection, I moved my cursor to the administrative panel. I did not offer a closing remark or a triumphant farewell. I simply clicked the termination icon, cutting the feed and plunging their screens into dark, silent isolation. The blackout of the video feed left my primary monitor displaying nothing but a serene default wallpaper of a pine forest. The digital silence was profound. I had severed their connection, but severing a transmission does not neutralize a desperate adversary. It merely forces them to seek an alternative vector of attack. Valerie and Trent were stranded on a floating resort, surrounded by oceans stripped of their credibility and starved of stolen capital. The minority shareholders were already drafting internal memos to isolate Trent from any remaining operational influence. The social currency Valerie had hoarded for years was evaporating by the minute. A rational actor, facing insurmountable forensic evidence, would seek a settlement or negotiate a quiet exit. Valerie was not a rational actor. She was an opportunist watching her reflection shatter. When a fabricated reality collapses, a manipulator will always retreat to the most rigid structure available to enforce their delusion. For Valerie, that structure was the municipal court system. She harbored a generational misunderstanding of modern authority. She believed that my cybersecurity expertise was nothing more than juvenile computer tricks. She assumed that a local judge wearing a black robe could simply bang a wooden gavel and magically erase encrypted server logs, federal injunctions, and recorded confessions. From her suite on the cruise ship, Valerie contacted her local legal representation in Minnehaha County. She employed a cut-rate probate attorney known for filing voluminous motions rather than executing sharp strategy. Valerie instructed him to file an urgent petition demanding immediate conservatorship over my incapacitated father and his entire commercial portfolio. She did not stop at seeking financial control. She instructed her counsel to draft a secondary complaint accusing me of corporate sabotage, cyber terrorism, and the illegal manipulation of proprietary data. She sought to have me arrested, hoping a criminal charge would invalidate the digital receipts I had presented to the board. The retaliation arrived 2 days later. I was sitting at my terminal, reviewing the restored access protocols for the logistics network when the receptionist notified me of a visitor. A bonded process server waited in the lobby. I walked out to meet him. He handed me a thick, sealed parcel bearing the official crest of the county court. The packet possessed a distinct, arrogant weight. I carried it back to my desk and let it fall onto the glass surface. The heavy, resonant thud of the legal summons landing on my workstation served as a physical declaration of war. I opened the parcel using a sleek metal letter opener. The petition contained dozens of pages filled with verbose, inflated accusations. Attached to the back of the filing was a scanned copy of Valerie's sworn affidavit. Her signature sprawled across the bottom margin. The handwriting was jagged, oversized, and deeply erratic, betraying the sheer panic driving her actions. The ink strokes pressed so hard they seemed to gouge the paper even through the scan. I did not feel a spike of fear. I felt a profound sense of tactical alignment. I retrieved a pristine manila folder from my desk drawer. I meticulously placed the court summons inside, aligning the edges perfectly. I picked up a black marker and wrote 2 words across the top tab: final execution. By initiating a formal lawsuit, Valerie believed she was trapping me in a protracted legal battle that would drain my resources and force a settlement. She envisioned months of depositions, discovery hearings, and agonizing judicial delays. She anticipated that I would cower under the threat of litigation. I placed the folder into my leather briefcase and immediately drove to the downtown financial district. The office of Thomas Smith smelled reassuringly of lemon wood polish and archaic law books. The veteran legacy attorney sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing a separate set of physical ledgers. I withdrew the manila folder and slid the court summons across the polished wood. Thomas adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, picking up the document with steady hands. He read the initial pages, his eyes scanning the aggressive demands for conservatorship and the fabricated allegations of corporate espionage. He did not display concern. Instead, the corners of his mouth twitched upward into a quiet, satisfied smile. "She took the bait," he stated, his voice resonating with deep approval. I sat in the high-backed leather chair opposite him, absorbing the confirmation. During our previous meeting inside his climate-controlled vault, Thomas had explained the intricate defense mechanisms coded into my father's irrevocable South Dakota trust. The legal fortress was designed to remain dormant, operating silently in the background of the logistics empire. It required a highly specific external trigger to awaken its offensive capabilities. My father understood that passive protection was insufficient against a predator like Valerie. He needed her to commit an unforced error on the public record. Thomas opened his desk drawer and produced a secondary copy of the original trust parchment. He turned to the contingency addendums. "The trust contains a hostile action protocol," Thomas explained, tapping the dense text. "A verbal threat or a forged medical proxy is not enough to activate the defensive shift. The legal architecture demands a formal documented attempt to bypass the trust's authority through a third-party judicial venue. By forcing her attorney to file this exact probate petition with the county clerk, Valerie has fulfilled the mandatory prerequisite. She has willingly stepped into the jurisdiction of the trap." Valerie assumed she was escalating the conflict to a higher authority. She failed to comprehend that in the state of South Dakota, an irrevocable trust supersedes a municipal probate court regarding asset distribution. Her petition did not grant her power. Her petition stripped her of standing. The moment the county clerk stamped her filing, the trust recognized a hostile invasion. That timestamp automatically invalidated any superficial claims she held over the commercial properties and defaulted total unassailable administrative control directly to the named protector. We possessed the digital forensics. We held the recorded confession of the notary. We now possess the executed legal trap. But Thomas cautioned that winning a paper war required more than just producing the correct documents at the hearing. A judge would review the cold data, but the defense would attempt to argue that my father never intended for the trust to operate in this manner. Valerie's lawyer would claim the decade-old paperwork was an outdated relic superseded by her recent marriage. They would try to introduce emotional doubt to cloud the rigid legal structure. "The opposition will argue intent," Thomas warned, folding his hands together. "They will tell the court that Donald loved his new wife, and that you are using an archaic loophole to steal her rightful security. We can defeat the petition on statutory grounds, but presenting a unified narrative removes any possibility of a judicial delay. We need to prove that your father foresaw her exact brand of treachery. We need a voice that predates Valerie, someone who can testify to the underlying emotional foundation of the trust itself." I nodded, understanding the strategic requirement. Data provides the framework, but human intent provides the context. I needed an unimpeachable witness who held the historical memory of my father's corporate vision. There was only one person alive who knew the depth of his protective instincts long before he ever suffered his medical crisis. I needed to visit the original architect of the family legacy. The battlefield was shifting from the courtroom preparation to a quiet room in an assisted living facility where the final key to unlocking our defense resided. The drive from the downtown financial district to the Oakwood Reserve took 20 minutes, carrying me away from the towering glass structures of corporate Sioux Falls and into the quiet, affluent western edge of the city. The assisted living facility was designed to resemble a sprawling private estate rather than a medical center. Manicured lawns and wide paved walkways replaced the sterile concrete environment of the hospital where my father lay tethered to machines. I parked my vehicle in the visitor lot and walked through the automated glass doors, the heavy glass sliding shut behind me to seal out the brisk South Dakota wind. I needed the final defining piece of our legal defense, and it resided on the 4th floor in a sunlit corner suite. I needed my grandmother, Sylvia. Sylvia possessed a mind as sharp as a diamond-cutting tool housed within a body that had gracefully surrendered to the passage of time. She had raised my father through lean years, watching him build his logistics empire from the ground up. She observed the late nights, the initial struggles, and the eventual regional dominance he achieved. More importantly, she had watched Valerie enter the picture. Sylvia never voiced her disapproval loudly at family gatherings. She operated with the quiet, devastating observation of a woman who understood human nature better than any behavioral algorithm I could write. The air inside her room smelled of fresh linen and expensive floral tea, a stark contrast to the cloying synthetic rose perfume Valerie always wore. Sunlight streamed through the large bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing suspended in the air. In the corner, a tall antique grandfather clock ticked with a heavy rhythmic cadence, marking the passage of seconds with mechanical certainty. Sylvia sat in a high-backed armchair, a handmade patchwork quilt draped across her lap to ward off the chill. She looked up as I entered, offering a warm, knowing smile that instantly cut through the residual tension of the ongoing legal war. I sat down on the edge of the velvet sofa opposite her chair. I did not soften the reality of the situation. I laid out the exact details of the hostile takeover with clinical precision. I explained the forged medical proxy Trent draining the operational accounts, the frozen offshore wire transfers, and the retaliatory probate petition Valerie had filed with the county clerk. I detailed how they sought to paint me as a volatile rogue actor in a desperate bid to steal the corporate portfolio. Sylvia did not gasp or express shock. She reached toward the small wooden side table next to her chair. Her arthritic, paper-thin hands gently picked up a silver-framed photograph. The picture captured my father standing in front of his very first delivery truck, a young man brimming with ambition long before the wealth and the predators arrived. She traced the edges of the frame with a slow, deliberate motion, her fingertips brushing the glass, protecting his smiling face. She always possessed the patience of a scavenger, Sylvia said, her voice raspy but resonant in the quiet room. Valerie assumed your father was blinded by her affection. She believed she could simply wait for his health to fail and then harvest the fruits of his labor without lifting a finger. She never realized that your father possessed the exact same patience, combined with a much sharper intellect. Sylvia set the photograph back onto the table, adjusting it so the frame faced the center of the room, keeping my father watching over our conversation. He came to visit me the week after he finalized that irrevocable trust, 10 years ago, she continued. He sat right where you are sitting now. He told me that his business had grown too large to leave unprotected, and he recognized the financial toxicity Valerie brought into his home. He knew Trent was bleeding capital through failed ventures, and that Valerie would eventually try to liquidate the logistics firm to cover those debts. I listened intently, processing the revelation. My father had masked his defensive strategy behind a veil of domestic compliance. He played the role of the accommodating husband while simultaneously encoding a legal kill switch into the foundation of his wealth. He understood that openly divorcing Valerie would initiate a costly, protracted asset division. Instead, he chose to quarantine the primary holdings within the Trust Kingdom of South Dakota, neutralizing her leverage without her knowledge. He used the very laws of our state to build an invisible vault. He encrypted the money so only you could hold the key, Sylvia stated, looking directly into my eyes. He told me that if the day ever came when she tried to cross the threshold, the system would require a protector who understood both loyalty and ruthless execution. He chose you, Fidelia. Not just because you are his daughter, but because you possess the discipline to shut the door and lock it permanently. I unzipped my leather briefcase and withdrew a pristine manila envelope. Inside rested the sworn affidavit drafted by Thomas Smith. The document articulated everything Sylvia had just spoken. It provided the sworn historical context, proving that the trust was not a forgotten relic, but an active, deliberate shield engineered specifically to thwart Valerie. It established clear generational intent, bridging the gap between my cold digital forensics and the emotional truth of a father protecting his legacy from a parasite. I handed her the document and a specialized archival pen. Sylvia read through the legal text, her eyes moving rapidly across the paragraphs. She did not hesitate. She pressed the pen to the signature line, her frail hand moving with practiced, unwavering intent. The ink settled into the paper, transforming the narrative from a private family memory into an admissible, devastating legal weapon. I took the document back, securing it inside my briefcase next to the raw server logs and the recorded confession. Sylvia then reached into the pocket of her knitted cardigan. She withdrew a small, ornate brass key attached to a faded silk ribbon. The metal carried a dull, oxidized patina, indicating its age and the infrequency of its use. She leaned forward, extending her trembling hand toward mine. I opened my palm, and she dropped the key into it. The brass felt surprisingly heavy against my skin, carrying the literal weight of my father's original corporate charter box. In a world governed by digital passwords and biometric scans, this physical artifact represented the genesis of everything we were fighting to protect. He asked me to hold on to this until the storm arrived. Sylvia whispered, her gaze piercing through the sunlit room. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour mark, the resonant bell echoing around us. He knew you were the only one smart enough to guard the gate. Use it. Do not leave them a single piece of the foundation. I closed my fingers around the brass key, making a silent vow. The puzzle was now entire and unbreakable. We possessed the forensic data to prove the forgery. We held the recorded testimony of the notary detailing the coercion. We had the active federal injunction freezing the stolen capital. We maintained the impenetrable South Dakota trust, invalidating the probate petition. And now we held the sworn historical intent of the matriarch stripping Valerie of her final defense as a grieving, misunderstood widow. The social maneuvering and the clandestine digital skirmishes had run their course. Valerie had forced the conflict into the public square by demanding an emergency hearing in the county court. She expected to walk into that room and leverage judicial authority to bypass my security measures. She expected me to arrive disorganized, intimidated by the formal legal environment, and lacking the resources to counter her hired counsel. She was about to discover that dragging a cybersecurity analyst into a courtroom does not change the nature of the war. It simply provides a larger audience for the decryption process. The hearing was scheduled for the following morning. I left the assisted living facility, the brass key resting securely in my pocket alongside the encrypted drive. I walked out into the crisp South Dakota air, my pulse steady and my strategy flawless. The trap was fully loaded, the evidence was organized into precise chronological exhibits, and the gavel was waiting to fall. It was time to pull all the threads together and introduce my stepmother to the unyielding reality of the Trust Kingdom. The heavy oak doors of the Minnehaha County Courthouse opened to admit a steady stream of spectators. The morning air outside carried a bitter chill, but the atmosphere inside the building felt thick with anticipation. The architecture of the room projected unwavering authority, featuring high vaulted ceilings, polished linoleum floors, and rows of dark wooden benches. Word of the corporate conflict had spread rapidly through the logistics firm and the local country club. The gallery filled quickly, leaving standing room only near the rear exits. The minority shareholders claimed the front row seats, their expressions unreadable, their postures rigid. They remembered the silent video feed from days prior, and they arrived to witness the final resolution of the leadership crisis. I sat at the respondent table, analyzing the room with the same detached precision I applied to a network security audit. Thomas Smith sat to my right. He placed a single pristine legal folder parallel to the edge of the desk, his hands folded patiently over the leather binding. I kept my laptop closed and stored inside my briefcase. There was no need to reference digital screens when the physical execution of our strategy was about to commence. I rested my hands flat against the cool, solid mahogany of the defense table. My pulse maintained a perfect, steady rhythm. The tactical groundwork was finished. Today required nothing but observation and timing. The rhythmic squeak of designer heels against the polished floor announced the arrival of the petitioners. Valerie walked down the center aisle leading her legal team. She wore a conservative dark-tailored dress that managed to convey mourning while still highlighting the expensive diamond pendant resting at her throat. She gripped a delicate lace handkerchief, pressing it gently against her dry eyes in a practiced display of sorrow. Trent trailed half a step behind her. He lacked his mother's theatrical endurance. The frozen offshore wire transfers and the crushing weight of his predatory debts had carved deep, visible lines of exhaustion into his face. His usual arrogant stride was gone, replaced by a rigid, nervous shuffle. He clutched a thick leather portfolio to his chest, his knuckles drained of color. He looked like a man walking toward a precipice, unsure if the bridge ahead would hold his weight. Valerie had retained a local litigator known throughout the county for high-volume filings and courtroom theatrics rather than precise statutory interpretation. He unpacked his briefcase with frantic, disorganized energy. The sharp rustling of his yellow legal pads and the loud snapping of his briefcase latches echoed loudly across the quiet room. Trent leaned over the partition, whispering urgently into the attorney's ear. The lawyer nodded dismissively, arranging his notes with a flourish. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Bennett took the bench. He was a veteran jurist with silver hair and a stern, weathered face, accustomed to navigating messy regional wealth disputes. He adjusted his reading glasses, opened the case file, and called the docket number, instructing the petitioner to begin. Valerie's attorney stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He paced a short perimeter in front of the judge, launching into an impassioned theatrical opening statement. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a dedicated wife attempting to maintain her hospitalized husband's legacy while being terrorized by a tech-obsessed estranged daughter. He claimed that my unprompted digital attacks were destabilizing a crucial regional supply chain and jeopardizing hundreds of local jobs. He returned to his table, picking up the forged medical power of attorney. He formally submitted the document into the official court record, waving the paper in the air for the gallery to see. He stated that the proxy granted Valerie unquestionable authority over the commercial real estate portfolio and the operational bank accounts. He demanded the immediate removal of the federal compliance hold that had frozen the offshore transactions. He insisted that the court grant full conservatorship to Valerie, allowing her to restore order and protect the estate from my alleged corporate espionage. I listened to the court reporter's fingers flying across the stenography machine. Every spoken word, every fabricated claim, every theatrical accusation was being logged permanently into the official transcript. In the realm of cybersecurity, you never interrupt a threat actor while they are depositing a traceable payload into a sandbox environment. You allow them to establish their connection, upload their malicious files, and reveal their origin point. You give them enough rope to secure their own trap. I applied that exact same principle to the courtroom proceeding. I sat entirely serene, letting them commit perjury on the record. Valerie amplified the performance. She let out a quiet, perfectly timed sob, bowing her head and covering her face with her handkerchief. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. A few country club acquaintances murmured in sympathy. Trent wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, his eyes darting toward the judge, silently begging for a swift ruling that would release his trapped capital. The attorney pushed his advantage, raising his voice to a booming crescendo. He demanded that the court issue an emergency injunction, stripping me of all professional credentials associated with the logistics firm. He asked the judge to authorize local law enforcement to seize my personal servers and conduct a criminal investigation into my hacking activities. He framed the entire petition not as a hostile takeover, but as a desperate rescue mission to save a dying man's life work from a rogue employee. Thomas Smith did not object. He did not raise his hand or interrupt the flow of lies. He simply watched the opposing counsel with the mild, polite interest of a teacher observing a student fail an exam. The lawyer finished his sprawling monologue, breathing heavily. He returned to his seat, offering Valerie a reassuring nod. The courtroom hung in a heavy, suspended silence. The theatrical display had clearly impacted the spectators in the gallery, but judicial rulings rely on statutes, not stagecraft. Judge Bennett organized his notes. He looked down at the submitted medical proxy, his expression neutral and unreadable. He then lowered his glasses and shifted his gaze across the room, fixing his attention directly on the defense table where I sat. The tension in the air grew thick, pressing down on the oak benches and the marble floors. The minority shareholders leaned forward in the front row, waiting for my response. Trent gripped the edge of his table, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. The judge cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He addressed Thomas Smith, asking if the respondent had any documentation or testimony to offer, in rebuttal to the emergency petition. This was the precise moment the digital and legal strategies converged. I unclasped my hands from the mahogany table and sat back in my chair. I looked at Valerie, meeting her tear-streaked, triumphant gaze with cool, clinical detachment. Her fraudulent structure had reached its maximum height. It was time to introduce the decryption key and watch the entire architecture shatter. Thomas Smith stood up, smoothing the front of his vest, and reached for the single legal folder resting on our desk. The true defense of the estate was about to begin. Thomas Smith rose from his chair with the measured grace of a man who had orchestrated victories in this room for 3 decades. He did not mirror the frantic pacing of the opposing counsel. He stood firmly behind our table, projecting a quiet, unyielding authority. The courtroom fell into a hushed anticipation. The minority shareholders leaning forward in the gallery knew Thomas by reputation. They understood that when he chose to speak, the landscape of a dispute fundamentally altered. "Your Honor." Thomas began, his voice calm and resonant, carrying easily to the bench, without the need for theatrical elevation. The respondent declines the opportunity to cross-examine the petitioner. We also decline the opportunity to debate the validity of the medical proxy submitted to this court just moments ago. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Valerie exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Trent. Her attorney puffed his chest, assuming our refusal to argue the facts constituted a surrender. He had spent his entire opening statement building a narrative of a hostile rogue daughter, and he believed our silence proved his fiction. "We decline to debate the proxy." Thomas continued, silencing the murmurs with a slight shift in his tone, because debating the authenticity of a fraudulent document is a profound waste of judicial resources when this court lacks the jurisdictional authority to enforce it. The smug expression vanished from the opposing lawyer's face. Judge Bennett lowered his reading glasses, peering over the rim at our table. He asked Thomas to clarify his position regarding the jurisdiction of the county probate court over the estate in question. Thomas reached down and opened the pristine legal folder resting on the mahogany surface. He withdrew the thick, cream-colored parchment. The heavy, tactile weight of the document commanded immediate attention. The state seal of South Dakota gleamed in the overhead lighting, authenticating the sharp, steady strokes of my father's signature at the bottom of the first page. 10 years ago, my client recognized the inherent vulnerabilities of acquiring significant commercial wealth, Thomas stated, holding the parchment for the judge to see. He understood that a sprawling logistics empire could attract opportunistic threats disguised as domestic partners. To ensure his legacy remained unbroken by future greed, Donald Phelan utilized the premier asset protection statutes of this state. He legally separated his personal identity from his financial holdings. Thomas signaled the bailiff, handing over the certified copy of the document to be passed to the bench. Donald placed his entire commercial real estate portfolio, his voting shares in the logistics firm, and his liquid operational capital into an irrevocable South Dakota trust, Thomas explained, as the bailiff walked the paperwork forward. On paper, Donald Phelan does not own the assets the petitioner is attempting to claim today. The trust owns them. Because a municipal probate court only governs personal property, the petitioner is asking Your Honor to grant her conservatorship over an empty room. The clerk received the parchment and began to scan the introductory clauses. Her hands stopped moving mid-page. She verified the ironclad seal, tracing the embossed edge with her thumb before passing it up to the judge. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses, reading the dense legal terminology that effectively walled off his own courtroom from the dispute. Valerie's attorney scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He objected, his voice tight with sudden panic. He claimed the trust was an archaic relic, an outdated piece of paperwork superseded by Valerie's subsequent marriage and the emergency medical proxy. He argued that the court must consider the emotional intent of a husband seeking to provide for his current wife during a health crisis. Thomas did not flinch. He reached back into his folder and produced the sworn affidavit signed by my grandmother just 24 hours prior. If opposing counsel wishes to discuss generational intent, we are fully prepared to oblige, Thomas countered, handing the second document to the bailiff. This is a sworn, notarized affidavit from Sylvia Phelan, the matriarch of the family and the original holder of the corporate charter keys. Her testimony provides the historical context of the irrevocable trust. Donald Phelan did not forget to update his estate planning. He deliberately preserved it. He confided in his mother that he knew his new wife harbored predatory financial habits. He engineered this specific legal structure to serve as a permanent, impenetrable firewall against the exact hostile takeover we are witnessing today. Valerie sank slowly into her chair. The delicate lace handkerchief she had used to dab her performative tears slipped from her fingers, landing unnoticed in her lap. Her carefully constructed facade of the grieving, overwhelmed widow vanished, replaced by an expression of stark, hollow terror. She stared at the judge, realizing her entire social and legal strategy was dissolving in real time. But the architecture of the trust holds one final provision, Thomas added, turning his attention directly toward the petitioner's table. A passive shield was insufficient for a man protecting his life work. Donald coded a dynamic defense mechanism into the foundation of the agreement. The trust contains a hostile action protocol. Thomas directed the court's attention to page 14 of the submitted parchment. The clause dictates that if any non-beneficiary, including a current spouse, attempts to bypass the trust's authority by filing a contested probate petition, the system executes an automatic administrative shift, Thomas read from his own copy. By forcing her legal counsel to timestamp that petition with the county clerk this morning, the petitioner unknowingly triggered the perimeter defense. The filing instantly stripped the current trustee of all remaining operational authority. Total, unassailable administrative control defaulted directly to the named secondary protector the moment the ink dried on the docket. I kept my posture perfectly serene, feeling the cool wood of the defense table under my fingertips. The courtroom sat in a breathless, suffocating silence. The opposing attorney physically dropped his pen. The plastic cylinder clattered sharply across his desk, rolling over his yellow legal pads and falling onto the hardwood floor. He did not bend down to retrieve it. He stared at the trust document in the judge's hands, the realization setting in that he had based his entire aggressive litigation strategy on a fabricated premise. Trent slumped forward, burying his face in his trembling hands. The lines of exhaustion etched into his features deepened into genuine despair. He and his mother had spent the last 6 months staging elaborate deceptions. They had forged a medical proxy in the dead of night, coerced a notary, and attempted to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars through untraceable offshore shell accounts. They had expended all their leverage trying to pick a lock on a door that my father had permanently bricked over a decade ago. Judge Bennett closed the file. He looked at the frantic, disorganized notes scattered across the petitioner's desk, then looked at the single, flawless legal instrument provided by Thomas Smith. The disparity in preparation and authority was undeniable. The judge did not request a recess to deliberate. He did not offer a sympathetic concession to the weeping stepmother. This court lacks the statutory jurisdiction to override an active, irrevocable trust established under South Dakota legacy law, Judge Bennett announced, his voice echoing with finality through the high vaulted ceilings. The assets in question are insulated from probate proceedings. The petitioner's request for emergency conservatorship and operational control is denied. The sharp, definitive crack of the judge's gavel struck the sounding block. The sound reverberated across the oak benches, signaling the instant terminal collapse of Valerie's ambition. The forged medical proxy sitting in the court record was rendered utterly useless, reduced to nothing more than a piece of discarded paper. The civil dispute was over, but the battlefield was about to transition into a far more dangerous arena. Judge Bennett did not immediately dismiss the parties. He picked up the forged proxy submitted by Valerie's counsel and placed it next to the digital forensic logs we had attached as supplementary exhibits. He noted the severe chronological anomalies regarding the notary stamp and the detailed records of Trent's rejected offshore wire transfers. The judge looked directly at the opposing attorney. He suggested that counsel might want to advise his clients on their Fifth Amendment protections. The civil petition was dismissed with prejudice, but the blatant evidence of corporate embezzlement and perjury now sat on the official public record. By bringing their fraudulent claims into a municipal courtroom, Valerie and Trent had unwittingly handed the local prosecutor a meticulously documented roadmap of their own felony crimes. The federal compliance hold trapping Trent's stolen capital was no longer just a bureaucratic delay. It was the genesis of a sprawling criminal investigation. The locked door they had tried so hard to open was about to become a prison cell. The echo of the gavel faded from the courthouse, but the structural collapse of the opposing faction resonated for months. The legal machinery operated with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of an automated firewall, neutralizing a detected virus. Trent did not walk out of the municipal building as a triumphant executive ready to command a logistics empire. He exited directly into the waiting jurisdiction of federal investigators. The compliance hold I initiated on his offshore wire transfers served as the primary exhibit for a sprawling indictment encompassing grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. The local prosecutor, armed with the pristine data logs and the recorded confession of a coerced notary, wasted no time executing a formal warrant. Federal agents seized his remaining electronics, uncovering the deep web of leveraged debts he had tried so desperately to hide. He surrendered his passport the following Tuesday. The luxury vehicles he leased under the corporate banner vanished repossessed by frantic creditors trying to recoup their staggering losses. Stripped of his stolen capital and facing mandatory minimum sentencing, his arrogant veneer dissolved into the panicked reality of a cornered criminal. Valerie experienced a different breed of liquidation. In Sioux Falls, elite social circles function on the strict currency of reputation and perceived stability. Hers evaporated the moment the trial transcript became public record. The country club associates who had offered her performative pity during the prayer luncheon read the news reports detailing her forged medical proxy and her attempt to hijack a dying man's legacy. The retribution of the social elite is swift and clinical. The invitations to galas and private dinners stopped arriving. Her board seat at the Regional Charity Foundation was quietly and unceremoniously revoked via a terse email. Local boutiques and high-end restaurants, aware of her frozen assets, politely declined her lines of credit. She found herself isolated in a small leased apartment on the industrial edge of town, drowning in the exorbitant legal fees generated by her failed corporate coup. I did not pursue further civil litigation against her. The organic consequences of her exposed perjury delivered a far more devastating verdict than any retaliatory lawsuit ever could. With the threat actors permanently removed from our perimeter, I focused all my processing power on restoring the compromised network of our family. My first operational directive prioritized my father. The sterile, hostile environment of the intensive care unit no longer dictated the terms of his recovery. Utilizing the boundless encrypted resources safeguarded within the irrevocable trust, I arranged for a specialized private medical transport. Donald returned to his expansive estate on the quiet outskirts of the city. We converted the spacious ground-floor sunroom into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation suite. The space was staffed by a rotating hand-picked team of elite private nurses and physical therapists who reported directly to my secure communication channel. He rested in his own home surrounded by familiar landscapes, the soft hum of premium medical equipment, and the quiet dignity he had earned over a lifetime of labor. The trust fulfilled its primary engineered function, deploying capital to protect the architect of the wealth without requiring a single signature of external approval. At the logistics firm, the transition of power occurred without a fraction of friction. The minority shareholders, having witnessed the undeniable, ruthless effectiveness of our digital and legal defense, offered their unanimous support. I assumed definitive control over the commercial operations, streamlining the corporate hierarchy. I did not relocate my workspace into my father's plush corner executive office. I remained in the Security Operations Center, governing the enterprise from the vantage point of data integrity and network stability. We stabilized the supply chain contracts, purged the remaining logistical inefficiencies introduced during Trent's disastrous tenure, and steered the company back toward sustainable, resilient regional expansion. The business partners who once doubted my capability now relied entirely on my architectural foresight to protect their investments. To immortalize the strategic brilliance that saved our legacy, I allocated a dedicated percentage of the annual corporate profits to establish a permanent endowment. I launched the Donald Phelan Cybersecurity Scholarship, providing full tuition funding and professional mentorship for young women pursuing advanced degrees in digital forensics and asset protection at state universities. It stood as a permanent living tribute to a man who understood that safeguarding the future required more than just generating substantial revenue. It required the discipline to build impenetrable boundaries and the wisdom to hand the keys to someone who knew how to guard the gate. The scholarship ensured that his philosophy of proactive defense would outlive us all, training the next generation to recognize threats before they breached the perimeter. 3 months after the final dismissal in county court, the chaotic noise of the conflict settled into a profound, enduring silence. I stood on the wrap-around cedar porch of my father's estate, leaning against the sturdy, weathered railing. The crisp South Dakota morning air carried the rich scent of damp soil and turning leaves a reminder of the shifting seasons. Golden sunlight filtered through the sprawling canopy of ancient oak trees bordering the property, casting long, peaceful shadows across the manicured lawn. My adopted rescue dog Clover trotted happily through the damp grass, stopping to inspect a patch of wildflowers near the reinforced perimeter fence. The world moved at a calm, deliberate pace, entirely unbothered by the dramatic ambitions of greedy people. I held a heavy ceramic mug in both hands, taking a slow, steady sip of dark roast coffee. The bitter, grounding flavor anchored me to the present reality. The estate was safe. The firm was thriving. The predators were exiled. I set the mug down on the wooden side table next to my smartphone. The device sat quiet and still for a long time, blending into the serene environment. Then the screen illuminated with a sudden silent notification. A voicemail had arrived from an unrecognized local number, bypassing the primary spam filters. The automated transcription software quickly processed the audio, displaying a fragmented, desperate plea for financial assistance and reconciliation. It was Valerie. She was attempting to bypass the silence, searching for a lingering emotional vulnerability she could exploit to regain entry into the fortress. I looked down at the flashing screen, watching her transcribed words crawl across the digital display. In the past, the mere sound of her voice might have triggered a spike of adrenaline, a surge of defensive anger, or a desperate need to justify my actions. Now it registered as nothing more than a blocked ping, attempting to access a secured server. She was a ghost, shouting at a concrete wall. I did not pick up the device to listen to the audio. I did not read the remainder of the transcribed message to decipher her excuses. I extended my index finger and pressed the delete icon with a single definitive tap. The screen went dark, returning the porch to its undisturbed tranquility. The ultimate defense against greed does not reside in anger retaliation or drawn-out courtroom battles. It resides in the structural integrity of your boundaries, proving that true power is simply the ability to encrypt your life, lock the gate, and walk away.
When the heavy oak doors of the Minnehaha County Courthouse finally swung shut behind me, the silence that followed wasn't just the end of a grueling legal battle. It was the quiet, echoing aftermath of a generational collision. As I walked out into the crisp South Dakota air, leaving my stepmother and stepbrother to face the devastating ruins of their own greed, I didn't feel the sudden rush of a conqueror. Instead, I felt a profound, aching clarity about what it truly means to raise a child in this world. My father's estate was secure, yes, but the real victory wasn't won in that courtroom. It was won decades earlier at a quiet kitchen table where a father consciously decided what kind of legacy he actually wanted to leave behind. Looking back at the wreckage of Valerie and Trent's lives, their tragedy wasn't merely that they got caught committing fraud. It was that they were fundamentally hollow. Valerie's approach to parenting serves as a dark mirror to a trap that ensnares so many families in modern American culture. She raised Trent to be a golden child, not to nurture his soul, but to use him as a vessel for her own social ambitions. She taught him that his worth was inextricably tied to the designer labels on his back, the prestige of a country club membership, and the illusion of unearned power. She demanded absolute compliance to her narrative and rewarded him with a crippling entitlement that left him utterly defenseless when the real world demanded substance. When parental love is conditional upon a child's ability to uphold a family's flawless public image, it ceases to be love at all. It becomes a transaction. A child raised as an instrument for a parent's ego doesn't learn how to survive, adapt, or build. They only learn how to pretend. The creation of a favored child to parade in public while subtly scapegoating those who refuse to conform to the charade is the rot that destroys the foundation of a home. My father chose a radically different path. He didn't hand me the master keys to a corporate kingdom and expect me to simply inherit his greatness. He handed me a compass, taught me how to read the stars, and told me to learn how to navigate the dark. He taught me the uncompromising value of substantive labor. In a society that is so frequently seduced by the polished veneer of immediate hollow success, he celebrated the quiet integrity of hard work, the kind of work that doesn't care about your last name or your zip code. Before we dive deeper into the hidden emotional currents of family loyalty and the true cost of inheritance, I invite you to become part of our community. If this story resonates with your own experiences, or if you find yourself questioning the dynamics at your own family dinner table, please hit the like button and subscribe to Still Drama Stories. Tell me in the comments below, what is the most valuable lesson your parents taught you about independence? Your perspective makes this space richer. Now let us return to the courtroom's aftermath. In traditional family structures, we are often force-fed the narrative that family is everything. It is at its core a beautiful sentiment. But without deep emotional awareness, it can easily mutate into a weapon of control. The concept of family first is too often manipulated to demand unreasonable sacrifices to excuse toxic behavior, or to force a child to endure psychological abuse under the guise of unwavering loyalty. My father understood the dangerous shadow of this tradition. By secretly establishing that irrevocable trust 10 years prior to his stroke, he didn't just protect his capital. He gave me the ultimate undeniable permission to enforce a boundary. He taught me that true filial piety does not mean suffering in silence or capitulating to emotional extortion. It means protecting the core values of the family, even if it requires shutting the door on the very people who share your roof. He taught me how to say a definitive, unapologetic no to toxic exploitation. By doing so, he wrapped me in an invisible armor that no guilt trip, no societal pressure, and no weeping courtroom theatrics could ever pierce. I often think about the stark contrast between Trent and myself when the crisis reached its boiling point. Trent, raised to rely on financial bailouts and maternal manipulations, panicked the moment the digital locks clicked shut. He had no internal resources and zero problem-solving skills because his mother had always bulldozed the path for him. When you systematically remove all the obstacles for your children, you tragically rob them of their opportunity to develop resilience. My true inheritance wasn't the millions of dollars held safely within the South Dakota Trust. My inheritance was the mindset required to defend it. It was the emotional regulation to sit in a country club sunroom eating a piece of artisan bread, while my character was being publicly assassinated and feeling absolutely nothing but clinical, unwavering focus. That level of emotional autonomy doesn't come from a trust fund. It comes from a parent who validates your reality from a young age, who teaches you the unwavering principles of fairness, and who raises you to trust your own judgment high above the deafening noise of the crowd. True financial and intellectual independence is the greatest gift a parent can bestow, because when a child knows they can survive entirely on their own 2 feet, they can never be held hostage by the promise of an inheritance. So what is a family legacy? We spend so much time in American culture chasing the tangible markers of success. But a legacy is not the sprawling commercial estates, the diversified stock portfolios, or the names engraved on hospital wings. Those are just physical artifacts waiting to turn to dust. A true family legacy is the psychological and moral architecture you carefully construct inside your children's minds. It is the mutual respect, the emotional safety, and the unyielding integrity they carry with them out into the unforgiving world. My father acted as a safe harbor. He looked far past the horizon to protect me from the greed and envy that he knew would eventually arrive at our doorstep. He built a culture of truth in our relationship, a quiet, encrypted bond of absolute trust that effortlessly outlasted all of Valerie's loud, performative lies. As the years pass, I sometimes sit on the wraparound porch of his estate, watching the South Dakota wind rustle through the sprawling branches of the old oak trees. The silence is comforting, but it also carries a lingering, heavy question. We all sit at dining tables surrounded by the people we call family. We pass the bread, we pour the wine, and we smile warmly for the holiday photographs. But beneath the surface, in the quiet spaces between the words, what are we actually building? Are we raising our children to be independent, fierce sentinels of their own lives? Or are we quietly turning them into hostages of our own unmet expectations? When the storm finally comes, and it always comes, will the locks hold? Or will we discover far too late that the real threat was already sitting inside the house?